So, welcome to the last episode of season talk of Talk Conversations on Race. And I'm always excited about the people that I get to interview, and today is no exception. I'm really excited about this interview. So, I have Ally Henny, who is an author. Her book, I Won't Shut Up: Finding Your Voice When the World Tries to Silence You, will be released by the time this airs. She is a writer, obviously, a speaker, an advocate minister, and vice president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective. Ally has an MDiv from Fuller Seminary, where she emphasized race, cultural identity, and reconciliation. And she hopes to lead a church someday, which is awesome. And she also says that she's a proud Chicago South Sider, which is really intriguing to me. So I'm going to ask her about that soon. Anyway, Ally, it's such an honor and a privilege to have you.
Oh, it's wonderful to be on your show. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. I was so insecure that I would get the time wrong because I asked Alexa 3 times today, what time is it in Chicago? What time is it in Chicago? Because I'm like, did I get it right? Is she going to be sitting there and I'm not there? Anyway, Ally, to begin with, can you tell us about your family of origin, meaning your parents, grandparents, where you grew up, all that good stuff, anything that comes to you?
Yeah, so I grew up in rural Missouri. I grew up in a small town outside of Kansas City. It was a small community of less than 20,000 people. I was raised in an extended family. So I had my parents, even though my parents got divorced whenever I was 7, but the people who were kind of in the picture of my early upbringing, and then after my parents divorced, the rest of my upbringing was my mom, and then I have a sister who's 12 years older than me, who was part of that upbringing. And then, of course, being, again, part of an extended family, that means that my grandmother, my aunties, my uncles, my cousins, my big cousins, they were all part of my life. And that was sort of where I came from, and where I grew up was in this big extended Black family. And the town that I grew up in was predominantly white, so there was a Black community there. We had a church there whenever I was growing up. Now there, I think, are like maybe 3 or 4 Black churches in the little town that I grew up in. But at the time, there was only one Black church. And so a lot of us attended there. And so kind of within that, you kind of had some of the vestiges of slavery and of Jim Crow, where a lot of the Black folks lived kind of on two streets in the town. There was housing projects. One of my uncles who grew up in the town where I was raised talks about how they like tore down a bunch of people's houses. They tore down a bunch of folks' houses to then put Black people in the housing projects. And so then my mom and my grandma and my aunties moved to where I was raised in 1970. And so whenever they moved there, they lived in those housing projects and stuff. And then my grandma was eventually able to get a HUD house on the other street that we all lived on, but where we lived was kind of segregated. One of the houses that I grew up in, I should say, like my mom's house, which was my primary address, but I also grew up at my grandma's house. And then after my grandma passed away, I spent a lot of time at one of my auntie's house. But one of the houses or 2 of the 3 houses that I grew up in weren't in that little area, but my grandma's house was in that area. My auntie's house, her house was kind of in another area of town where she had a house, and she had a nice house, but behind where she lived it wasn't really like housing projects, but it was like another kind of form of affordable housing that then like a lot of the other like Black families, newer Black families, and poor white families had migrated to. And so my aunt lived in this neighborhood that was kind of a combination. It was like a mixed income neighborhood that she lived in. So anyway, yeah, so like where I came from, came from a family with a strong sense of Black identity, a strong sense of who we are, who we were as Black folks, but then kind of in the backdrop of this small, predominantly white town, with growing up around a lot of racism. I mean, being called the N-word, that was a rite of passage. Honestly, like a lot of us, I say a rite of passage. It wasn't something that we celebrated,
Right, of
but
course.
it was something that that was just an inevitable part of your
Mhm.
life. Experiencing racism was just an inevitable part of your existence. And so a lot of my upbringing was kind of this, kind of even between, feeling like it was between two worlds in a lot of ways, because I had my Black world with my Black family, and then there were a few white people, in my family, a few interracial relationships or marriages, within my family, but like the culture of my family was Black. And so being in those contexts, and being, we're watching the Black shows on TV. Of course,
Mhm.
we didn't have BET,
Right, right.
until I was in high school, because again, white
Yeah.
town, like even the cable was racist where I grew up.
Right.
We didn't have, we didn't get BET until I was in high school.
Yeah.
And so it was MTV, it was watching, Fresh Prince, it was watching Family Matters, it was watching the
Mhm.
Cosby Show,
Mhm.
it was watching Soul Train, it was watching whatever
Yep.
things from our culture that we could access,
Yes.
because the TV was kind of the window. Because this was, I grew up I'm a 90s and late 80s 90s kid. I graduated high school in 2004, so a lot of I have an even kind of upbringing of without the internet, so the analog world without
Yes.
the internet.
Yes.
And then I also came of age in the internet age too, so I have both of those. Being born in 1985, being a geriatric millennial, I kind of have both of those experiences. And
Be
I use
careful, be
geriatric
careful
instead
about
of
age.
elder.
Be careful about age. I think I got a few years on you.
Yeah. But, I use the term geriatric
I know.
millennial, um, ironically, because it's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm geriatric now. Okay, and I'm gonna be 38. I'll be 38 this summer, but it's like, oh, okay, I guess that's the language we're using. And a lot of people like elder millennial, but I'm just like, no, I'm gonna go whole hog with it, because at some point we are gonna be geriatric, like
I
for
know.
real.
Embrace
We're gonna be geriatric for real, so we might as well just embrace it. Like on
it.
today, we might as well just be like, okay, yes, it's whatever.
That's right.
So anyway, so yeah, so like, the television was sort of our window into the rest of the wide world.
Mhm.
But then there was this juxtaposition where it was the world of my family, the Black world of my family, but then going into the rest of the world outside of my grandma's house, outside of my grandma's neighborhood, outside of our church, and that type of stuff. And it was completely different. It was a completely different world. So it was like having to learn how to live in those completely different worlds. And something that I've always said, and then I'll shut up and let you ask another question, but something that I just, my own sense of self, is that there was never a point in time where I didn't know where I was Black. And so like a lot of people who grow up in predominantly white contexts, a lot of people, with different experiences, they have, or even people that maybe grew up in predominantly Black contexts and then find themselves in white spaces. Like I hear people's stories where it's like there was a moment where they realized they were Black.
Mhm.
I never didn't have that self-awareness that I
Mhm.
was Black. Like there was never a moment where I like learned like, oh, I'm Black people. Like I can't like that, like I am who I've always
Mhm.
been. And yeah, so like it's so that's always kind of been my sense of self. That's always, Blackness has always been my center of my center and my awareness. And so then whenever you talk about experiencing racism and that type of stuff, I just had this very early awareness, and I don't necessarily even know how I came by it, but I just always had this early awareness that Black people were were kind of viewed differently than white people. And
Mhm.
I developed an early awareness of race and racism. And so
Mhm.
that was kind of the outworking of some of my upbringing and everything.
Mhm. It's so interesting because we grew up in opposite demographics. I grew up in Brooklyn, which is certainly not rural Missouri,
Mhm.
but at the same time, so I'm biracial. My father is deceased; he was African American. My mother's white, and I did have that. Even though I grew up in such a diverse community, a diverse neighborhood, a diverse apartment building, and schools, still, my mom being the sort of main progenitor of culture, um, I did have that. Oh, like in college, really, it's like I'm a Black woman
Mhm.
because growing up, it was not Black enough for my Black peers. So then, sort of migrating to my white peers, and then realizing, okay, I'm definitely not white. So who am I? And then in college,
Mhm.
having the come to Jesus moment, just the realization, like I'm a Black woman. So
Mhm.
it's just interesting. And I think in your case, I imagine a lot of your groundedness in your racial identity was because of such a strong extended family and the churches that you attended. Whereas for me, I had my Black grandparents, but that was it, and
Mm.
we didn't see each other that much.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it just shows the strength and importance of family and
Yeah,
church,
definitely.
and
Definitely.
even more so than demographics, in terms of where
Yeah.
geographically
Mhm.
you're growing up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really astute observation because like you said, I mean, you growing up in Brooklyn, growing up in one of the most diverse cities,
Yes.
growing up adjacent to Queens, which is like literally the most diverse place on earth.
Yep.
On earth, Queens is. And so, but then being a country girl from rural Missouri, from rural Western Missouri, definitely there's definitely, I think that there is a factor of who you're with,
Mhm.
who your people are,
Mhm.
and who's being the person who's the purveyor or the progenitor of culture, and what cultures we get to absorb and
Mhm.
get to find ourselves in. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah, totally. So there were little absorptions from my grandparents and, my dad watching Muhammad Ali and shadow boxing with the TV and telling Aretha to sing, but there, but there it was we weren't submerged in it
mm,
like you were.
yeah.
So yeah, that's amazing. So now, what about your family today, your personal family? And then I would love to know why you're a proud Chicago South Sider. I mean, I'm a proud Brooklynite, so I guess that shouldn't be a question. But anyway, why are you proud of being Chicago South Sider?
Yeah, yeah. So my family now, I have been married. It'll be 18 years on June 18th. I married my high school sweetheart, and we have two daughters who just finished kindergarten and just finished or is finishing third grade. My kindergartner graduated yesterday. She's at school because there's a carnival at school
Oh,
today. But then I think my third grader doesn't officially finish until a couple of days from now. But yeah, so I have two of them. My husband is white. His family, which of course, I mean, he's American. His family, like everybody alive in his family, is American, but their cultural heritage and identity is German and Swiss
mm,
and Prussian, which is like German
mhm,
basically, which is like an area, was an area
mhm.
of Germany or whatever. And I don't know, like all these European people, like they fight wars, they get mad at each other, they redraw
Basically,
their things, and it's like, oh, so you're part of something that doesn't, people speak different languages, whatever. But his family culture was definitely pretty, like, highly informed by the German immigrant experience.
mm,
He grew up Lutheran, which, if you don't know, like, Martin Luther was from Germany,
yeah,
Protestant Reformation, that whole bit. And so his family primarily has been the family that he's been connected to has primarily been farmers, and then he's like actually him and my sister and brother-in-law are actually the first generation from that, and then their cousins also are some of the first generation to not be like farmers and
Mm.
stuff, because they've been farmers for multiple generations, whenever they came from Germany, and then his mom's side they were farmers and artisans, and so his mom is an artisan. His mom is she taught industrial arts for about 30 years in the public school system and stuff, and so like she's really good at like home repair type stuff, and so my husband's really handy and everything. He does
That's
a lot of
awesome.
woodworking. He's really handy. If it's broke, he can fix it, or he knows enough to know that he can't fix it, and so we hire somebody else. But anyway, so we lived in Missouri. We both grew up in the same town. He went to a farm school in the around where the farming community where he lived, but we went to the same high school, and that was where we had met, and so we got married after our freshman year of college, and so we've been together, or basically like our relationship this year will be old enough to drink and will be old enough to buy cigarettes. Like that's like, or I guess old enough. That's probably buying cigarettes is probably like a bad example. That's just it's old. I guess old enough to vote. That's probably our relationship is old enough to drink and old enough to vote this year. We've been together for long enough for like a whole person to have gained those rites of passages during our relationship. And so we moved to Chicago in 2020, like right as like literally like the pandemic was happening. We put in the offer on our house. The pandemic was it was the early days of the pandemic whenever we moved in. Our first week in Chicago was when George Floyd was killed, and so my first week in Chicago we were unpacking, and I was going to protest downtown. And so I really love Chicago. I really like it here. We moved to Chicago because we used to live in Springfield, Missouri, which is southwestern Missouri. We had gone to Missouri State University in Springfield, and then we had bought a house. We'd lived there for a while. We moved to the Washington, D.C. area for a few years. That's actually where our oldest was born, was in Washington, D.C. And then we moved back to Missouri. I found out that I was pregnant like literally the day that we were leaving our house in Virginia. We found out that I was pregnant with our second child, and we moved back to Missouri because I had a job offer at a church there, and so I had been a youth pastor. That was my vocation for a while. I've always been in ministry. So we were there. We were back in Missouri. We got there like in 2016, so right before the election, like in June of 2016. So kind of before everything had really changed with the election of Donald Trump. We were there for the election of Donald Trump. And so then after being there for 4 years and sort of realizing like we were happy to be back home because Missouri at that point was home to us. And so we were happy to be in closer proximity to my mom and my husband's parents. They lived within a few hours from us, so within driving distance that to where our kids could visit them frequently, and we could see them frequently, and have free babysitting and stuff for weekends. And whenever I was in seminary, have some place that people could go so I could write papers and whatnot. But Missouri like really, really super duper changed. And a lot of that change I noticed happened with President Obama being elected. And I actually have a chapter in my book called Barack Obama is the Antichrist, where I talk about some of my experiences working at a church when working at a predominantly white church whenever President Obama was elected. Yeah. And so Missouri had started to change, then, because Missouri, Missouri would vote Democrat, it would vote Republican. It was kind of a blue collar. There were a lot of blue collar Democrats and stuff. And then in 2008, stuff started to change. But then in 2016, things really started to change. And so I sort of realized, this doesn't Missouri doesn't feel like home anymore, or at the very least, like Springfield doesn't feel like home. I don't feel good about raising my kids here. And having myself grown up and having experiences as a Black kid in predominantly white schools, and the experiences with racism and stuff that I had, I realized that I was bracing myself for my kids to have that experience, to have some of those experiences. Well, I mean, as a parent, like, what parent, doesn't want their kids to have a better life or better experiences than they did? And I mean, I had a good upbringing, I had a good life, but I also lived in a predominantly white town and experienced racism. And I talk about some of my experiences even in school as an elementary school kid in my book with racism. I cover some of that in the early chapters of I Won't Shut Up. And there's just got to be a point when it was like, because I lived in the Washington, D.C. area for a while, and that was the town where we lived. It was still majority white, but there was a significant like diverse population there. Like where the little area where we lived, there were multiple languages spoken. There were Asian people in where our townhouse was. There was Asian people. There, I would see ladies wearing hijab or even wearing full burqas, walking down the street. The one of the people who worked at the Popeyes that we frequented around the corner from our house, she wore hijab. There were lots of Black and biracial people, lots of Hispanic people, and so I had that was kind of my first exposure to, because Springfield isn't diverse at all. So that was my first exposure to, and I was in my mid-20s. That was my first exposure to living amidst diversity, and so I knew what it was like to be around diverse people and to have just so many options and whatever. So then moving back to Missouri, it kind of felt like, a cultural wasteland in a lot of ways. And so I was just like I knew that it didn't have to be that way. I knew
else.
Yes, like I knew I had experienced something else. And so, and I say that because before we had moved to Virginia, I had no vision. And it was even before. Yeah, I had no vision for. I didn't have to be the only Black person in places. I had no vision. I had no concept of that.
And you always were, yeah.
Because I always was, or I was always one. There'd be a handful of us, and that was just my life. And I remember the very first time. It was before we moved to Virginia. Actually, it was the summer before we moved to Virginia. We had vacationed in Richmond, and Richmond is by just a little fractions of a percent, but Richmond City is a majority minority city, and so it's like 51% or like 50 point something or whatever percent minority, and actually I think that probably 49% of that is Black. And so it's like 49 point whatever percent that's white. So it's 50-50 Black and white. And I remember the first time I visited Richmond, I felt like I was in Wakanda. There were so many Black people. I had never in my life just seen in something that wasn't something that was specifically for Black people, and so we're all going to be together, or being on an island, like a Caribbean island where take a vacation in Jamaica. Of course, there's going to be Black people there.
Right.
But it was my first experience in the United States of being where I could see where literally every other person is Black, and I just wanted to run up and and hug people. We went to a restaurant, our first night there, and everybody in the restaurant was Black, and that was such an eye-opening experience for me. So then coming back home and living living in Springfield and being like, I can go a whole day. I can go multiple days where the only Black people that I see is myself in the mirror and my 2 kids, and that's it. That's it. That's all the diversity. Or like, you know, like, and I went to at one point, you know, I went to a diverse church on Sunday, so I would see Black people at church on Sunday, but during the week it was me, myself, and I.
Yes.
I was out here. It was me, myself, and I. So then I was like, you know, it doesn't have to be this way. My kids don't have to have these same experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was in seminary and everything for a lot of the time that I lived in Springfield the second time. And so I was like, as soon as I get done with seminary, we have got to go someplace different. And so I ended up visiting Chicago a few times and was like, oh, this place is like, you know, nice. I really like it. Chicago is extremely segregated. Extremely segregated. It's Chicago is a racist city. A lot of people don't think that, but yeah, I mean, these big cities, I mean, racism everywhere. Chicago's extraordinarily. Go ahead.
Sorry, just northern cities, the Great Migration. It's like we're in Rochester, New York, and it's the same thing. Anyway, I'll continue.
No, you're good. You're good. But yeah, like it's so, and people don't realize that. I think the people from places, the people who don't live up here, don't realize that legacy of the Great Migration, right? Where it's diverse, but it is also very segregated, and the white people here are very racist, and it's like that for a reason. Like, yes, there's a mix of people, and depending on where you go, like in the city, you see lots of diversity, and it's beautiful. But this city is also extremely segregated. But for me, what I realize is we're like, you know what? I would rather be segregated and yes, like, you know, there's lots of things that there's inequity, and there are things that we have to contend with because of the inequity here. But I was like, you know what? I would rather my kids go to a predominantly Black school, and that's segregated, and that has been excluded from having resources. Some people will say under-resourced. No, we are excluded from resources systematically because of systemic racism. I would rather have my kids have that experience than for them to experience, well, you know, the school's all right, but then they also are, you know, being called the N-word. They're also having like all these other types of experiences. So it's like, you know, I have the resources, I have the time, I have the ability. Not everybody has this, but I can be like, okay, cool, you know, so I can make sure that my kids are learning what they're supposed to learn. I can fill in those gaps. I can do all those things, but I would much rather have that experience and have to contend with the systemic racism and be mad about the systemic racism and be like, you know, my kids want the puffy Cheez-Its, and it's like, baby, we are in food apartheid down here. Like we can't like we can't just, our store doesn't just have like puffy Cheez-Its. Like that's like, you know, that might be something that shows up at Walgreens or Family Dollar on occasion, but we are in, some people call it a food desert. Bro, this is food apartheid down here. So we will take what we can get from the store, and maybe, you know, we can run over to Indiana and find something and find your little puffy Cheez-Its in the store there or whatever. But it's like, because I guess, you know, I have resources, I have whatever, I have means, that it's like, I would it's like I can be angry about that. I can be angry about food apartheid in my neighborhood. I can push back against that and be involved in my community and be involved in activism and that type of stuff, and vote and do all of those types of things to try to change the system. But I know that there are a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people here who are very weary and wary of the systemic racism. But I experienced so much of the interpersonal racism, of the questioning relationships, of all this other type of stuff, that it's like, for me, it's like, if I'm going to choose, I guess that I'll choose systemic for right now, and maybe that'll change. Or I'll be like, oh no, we got to go back to the interpersonal stuff, fam. Like we can't whatever. But I just, so I'm there, and I'm here, and I love Chicago, and for all warts and all, but it really is a great city, and a lot of the things that people say about Chicago, a lot of it is cap. A lot of it isn't even, it's not even real. This isn't the most dangerous city in America. this place doesn't have the most, it's a big city of almost 3 million people. And sometimes those 3 million people don't get along. And some of the issues that are here are because of systemic racism, not because people are just inherently, Black people are inherently bad and whatever. So, yeah.
Gosh, that was, there's so many places I could take that, but yes, to all of it. Here in Rochester, I get so tired of people talking about New York City as if it's, a war zone. And it's this fear mongering that really a lot of it is stemmed from racism, because Rochester, like Chicago, is very segregated, and there's the city of Rochester, and then there's the suburbs, and the folks in the suburbs look at any place where there's majority Black and brown people as a war zone, and oh, you don't want to go downstate, it's you're going to get shot in the street, and it's like it's just fear mongering, and it's based in racism, and also, it's interesting because we've sort of made the opposite decision as you, but we're always questioning it. We moved here because of my husband's job and wanted the good schools that are in the suburb, the better resource schools that are in the suburbs, and so chose to move to the suburbs when our boys were little. And now that they're 12 and almost 16, we question our decision all of the time. Because of the racism that they experience, because they're so used to being the only, they're not literally the only, but might as well be the only. There's some Black people in the suburbs that we live in, but not tons, so we go to a Black church, they go to the youth group at the church. My husband is Jamaican, so we get to Jamaica where they're like,
oh yeah,
it's like, oh yeah, it's like all, and you realize what a burden it is to carry, to be self-conscious of your color all the time, and how much of a relief it is to shed that self-consciousness, even just for a time. It's just so heavy. So, we have these oases, but we often think if we were to do it again, live in the city and figure out education, however, and always sort of like looking around at other places, like, oh, maybe that place, maybe that, but there's so many things that have to come in line to make a move. But anyway, all
such a good point.
All this just to say, I hear you. It's just I think every or most Black families deal with this decision. And I'll say one more thing, and then I want you to say what you were about to say. But a while ago, I listened to a podcast, and they were interviewing a Black author named Charles Blow. And I can't remember the name of the book that he had just written. But in that book, he's basically putting a call out to Black people in the North to return to the South so that we're not up here by ourselves, but we're back to where the majority of Black people still are, where we would have a sort of our finances, our political power would sort of coalesce, instead of being the one, the only among so many in the Northeast, Northwest, Midwest.
Anyway. Well, that decision, like that was actually what I was going to say, is that, the decisions and stuff that we have to make as Black families, as a lifelong Midwesterner, Missouri is the lower Midwest. Some people consider Missouri the South. Missouri is not the South. People from Missouri want to be Southerners so bad, but they are not. But we are not. Missouri stayed in the Union during the Civil War. It was a slave state, and so that's why a lot of the culture is set up the way that it is. But Missouri entered the Union in 1824 as a slave state. It was the Missouri Compromise. So I think it was Missouri and Maine that Maine entered the entered the Union as a free state. And so then of course we're next door to Kansas, and then you had bleeding Kansas, and you had and especially where I'm from, this was like a prominent thing with the Jayhawkers and the Bushwhackers going back and forth. The Bushwhackers were Missouri, the Jayhawkers were Kansas, going back and forth, fighting each other over slavery, fighting people. The Jayhawkers were coming, literally killing all the white people in town and liberating slaves, burning, razing towns. There are towns near where I grew up that had been razed by Jayhawkers coming from Kansas, because they were like, no, y'all gonna get rid of these slaves up in here. And then Bushwhackers going over and being like, no, we're gonna vote to try to make Kansas a slave state, because we want to perpetuate slavery. It was a whole entire thing. But like culturally, like where Missouri, where places like Illinois and all this other type of stuff it's not the South. But then you see and experience racism in ways that are very much like the South. In fact, Illinois, of any state in the Union, had / has the most sundown towns, historic sundown towns. Illinois. Illinois, which just completely boggles my mind. It also makes it very interesting to travel downstate. I have to go because Chicago's northern part of Illinois. St. Louis, Missouri, like where I have to go through, where I end up, going through to get home, is closer to downstate Illinois. So you have to drive I-55 or I-57 down, and so you're going through all these cities. I'm like, oh, I recognize that name as a sundown town. Wherever I see it, like I'm constantly looking, like, and trying to memorize which cities used to be sundown town, which ones had history of racism, so I know where not to stop on the road. But there's decisions that we have to make, and so for me, being a lifelong Midwestern, being terrified of the South, honestly. Like, and some of my Southern friends are like, yeah, and it's like, no, and I understand that some of my fear of the South is warranted, and some of it is stereotype and unwarranted. But it's like, oh, do I want to move to a place like a Florida, or one of my best friends lives in Pensacola, Florida, and I'm like, and I always give him a hard time about living in Florida, about being a Florida boy and whatnot. But it's like, do I, it's a beautiful place, whatever, but do I really want to live with all of that history, all of that present for Florida, stuff that their governor is doing like, today. Right. Do I want to live in that? Do I want to live, in places like Dallas and Houston? Do I want to live in some place like, even Atlanta? And I thought about going to Atlanta, but I was like, do I want to be in Georgia? Do I want that? And do I want, talking about kids, because this was even a concern of mine living in Virginia, about what are my kids going to be taught about the Civil War? What are my kids going to be taught about slavery and about Jim Crow and about whatever, where I know what they're going to be taught up here. And some of it's going to be like, oh yeah, we didn't do anything wrong. We were like, so that's what some of it's going to be, but it's like, no, but y'all also are super racist. But we have to make these decisions about, so you say, you made the inverse decision for your family. And, I think that, time will tell for my family. Time always tells. And, I don't think that there's a right or wrong decision for me. And your kids are older than my kids. Y'all, you were older than me. I've seen people in your generation make that decision, and have seen people who are young, my age or younger than me, whose parents made those decisions, and what they grew up in, and what they and how they understood themselves and their experiences, compounded with my own experiences of growing up in a predominantly white town. And I said, no, I'll take my chances. I'll take my chances on the south side of Chicago. I'll take my chances with, somebody could get shot. Something could I'll take my chances with okay, we could have gaps in our education. And I just decided, like that was a decision, was I'm going to take chances. I'm gonna take a chance. And like, yes, those are some pretty serious things. I don't want to be cavalier about gun violence. My neighborhood, yes, there's gun violence, but it's not at a level to where, like, I'm not afraid to go out, which I'm people from here who are from here, like, or who've lived here for a while, like, always gasp. Like, I walk around Chicago by myself all the time. And
Yeah.
people are like, wow, that's bold. I'm like, you know what? If I get got on the street, you know it. If I'm on the south side, if I'm in my neighborhood and I get got, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. Right.
I know that it wasn't a hate crime. You
No.
know, my family knows that if my body is out here lying, you know, on some street, like, it's because I just was at the wrong place at the wrong time. That's
Mhm.
it. There's no, like, if my body was found on a street in Springfield, Missouri, if my body was laying on National Avenue or Commercial Street or something like that in Springfield, Missouri, we would have to wonder whether or not it was a hate crime. My family doesn't, you know, as sad as that would be, my family can at least be at peace that I didn't get lynched.
Yeah.
I probably didn't get lynched unless it was the cops. If it was cops, then I got lynched. But then yes, if it was the cops, it was probably a lynching. But if
Yeah.
I just got, and so just those types of things where you calculate, you're just like, and so for me, the calculation is, okay, you know what, if we get got, like, hopefully, you know, hope and pray to God that doesn't happen. You know,
Yeah.
hope that my kids, you know, all I can do is pray and hope that my kids be safe. But actually, Springfield, Missouri per capita actually has more like killings and murders and stuff than Chicago. But anyway, we're safe. We're actually safer
Yeah.
in Chicago, statistically. And so I
Yeah.
just was like, you know, that's the calculus that you have to do, because you can't get being in your culture, being in your culture, being in places and areas that are gonna help and they're gonna uplift you. You can't get that and not also experience the systemic aspects of poor education system,
Yeah.
of public safety, of community violence, and all this other type of stuff. And the issue, again, it's not Black folks, it's white people. The issue is white supremacy.
Right.
And so white supremacy lets white people they can choose, they can live anywhere, and they can get all of those things. They can choose their battles. And yes, there is definitely, you know, class, there's definitely financial resourcing and stuff. But in a perfect world, you get enough money to move someplace. If a family can gather if a poor white family can gather their resources and move out of Appalachia, or move out of the Ozarks, or move, you know, from you know, rural Mississippi or something like that,
Yeah.
and get to someplace else where there's more flourishing. If they can do that, there's choices. They don't
Yeah.
have to be like, oh well, but you know, if we move here versus if we move here, I'm gonna have to deal with this, have to do that. But we have a whole calculus that we have to do. You know, is my water going to be clean? So I can be with my culture, but is my water going to be clean? Is my air going to be clean? My kids can have a good education, but are they going to be the first and the only all the time? We don't. The calculus that we had to do is completely different.
Yeah, that's so true. And what a lot of people don't realize is in any city, the majority of crime is usually in a very small geographic area. It's a few
Mm-hmm.
city blocks. So, you know, growing up in Brooklyn and, you know, going on the subway all the time, and I went to high school in Manhattan and everything. Growing up, we just knew where not to go. You know,
Exactly.
I knew the subway stops that I wasn't going to get off of. I knew,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I knew I was very comfortable walking from the subway to my house after dark, you know, because in the winter in the north, it's dark by 5.
Yeah.
So if I stayed at school late, it was dark walking home on the subway, but I didn't
Mm-hmm.
feel nervous. So, you know, people act as if the whole city is a gun zone, and that's not the
Right.
case. It's certain places where there happens
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, where that's, you know,
Mm-hmm.
tends to be kind of gang dominated, and you don't want to get caught in the crossfires of all of that
Yeah.
stuff. And also that anywhere that you have concentrations of poverty, whether it's concentrations of Black poverty or concentrations of white poverty, there's going to be certain certain bad things that flourish.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
they don't
Exactly.
flourish because of the color of their skin. They flourish because of a lack of opportunity and resources and all, you know, so many things. But it's not because it, you know, as Christians, we don't think that criminality gets baked into your genetic code, you know?
Yeah.
You know, that's
Yeah. And you know, and that's a great point, because you know, the neighborhood that I lived in Springfield, Missouri, was one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. And I mean, I was like dealing with people who were overdosed on meth. In like there was one time that my husband was going to pick up one of the kids from preschool, and he drove off from the house and he called me and he was like, there's someone laying in our bushes, like you need to go out, because he had to go, he couldn't help them because he had to go and get our kid. And so he was like, there's somebody laying out in the bushes, like you need to go and like, you know, check on them or like call an ambulance or something like that, because it doesn't look good. And so I went out there, looked, you know, sure enough, this person is just she's lying on the sidewalk, right, like part on the sidewalk, partially like in our yard in the bushes. She's out, I can tell, like, you know, it's meth, like that's it like she's on meth. If she's not OD'd, she's like severely strung. And you know, it's hot outside. And I gotta like, you know, okay, I'm gonna call the ambulance for this person because like she looks like she needed medical assistance. As soon as I said that I called the ambulance, she miraculously, like, she found the wherewithal to get up and to like walk away, because she didn't want to be caught, like because I mean, she was on drugs, she'd be caught, she you know, was fearing jail and all this other type of stuff. But I mean, that type of thing, I mean like people laying in my yard, people stop, like that was like a regular occurrence. And that was a function of poverty. I mean, there was a prostitution ring that was that a bunch of sex workers were busted in the park behind my house. Like that. So like the manifestation, the different things that go on within poverty, but people didn't talk the same way about the north side of Springfield as they did about this. So you go to Springfield, you talk to people, they're in a whole, you know, culture war thing right now. A lot of those people would start talking about Chicago, and it's like, bruh, like your like literally here in your city, on the north side of your city, there's like there's stuff going on. There's stuff that I seen living there that I have never seen in Chicago. And I'm not saying it don't exist, but what I'm saying is that for a city this size, if you scale it up, it's some stuff that I should be seeing some things, and I am not seeing those things. I'm not seeing those things, or I'm not seeing them as regularly as I was seeing them back in Springfield. And so, you know, we have these ideas about people, and you bring up, like, you know, as Christians, like, we should know that criminality isn't baked into people. But the thing is that a lot of Christians really believe that there are certain things, because, and I think that some of it is because some of our poor understanding of sin, our poor understandings, our poor and faulty, sometimes even rooted in white supremacy understandings of sin and of transgression against God and of all these other types of things. We Christians, I won't say we, there are some Christians that look at certain people and certain groups of people, and they see their condition as a moral failure. So there are Christians that look at poverty and see poverty as a moral failure, even though Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are who? The poor. Even though Christ said it is easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. Now, of course, Jesus was referencing a specific gate in Israel that was not like a literal needle. I'm like, oh, a camel's gonna walk through this. No, like he was talking like literally about a gate called the eye of the needle that was small, that was hard for camels, that was difficult for camels to walk through. But Jesus said these things. But Christians, specifically even white Christians, treat poverty as if it was a moral failing. And so they treat people who are addicted as who are drug addicts as if that's a moral failing. That's not a moral failing. That is a disease. That is a person who has a disease. Who, I mean, it could have been anything that they could have ended up addicted to. Number one. Number two, like, you know, you have these substances that people have that they that creates dependency, that using the substance creates dependency. And one of the big things I see about this is whenever it was the crack epidemic.
Mhm.
And I know being a Brooklynite, you know about
Mhm.
a Brooklynite that grew up during a certain time. I know that you know about the crack epidemic. I know about the crack epidemic growing up in rural Missouri.
Mhm.
That ravaged the Black community in my little town in rural Missouri. But
Mhm.
whenever it was Tyrone strung out on crack cocaine, it
Mhm.
was whenever it was crack babies. I remember them having a news report, and they have like little babies, shaking and talking about crack babies and all this other types of babies that were born with withdrawals because it was Black people. And it was because it was Black people, it was a moral thing. And it
Yes.
was, we have to have a war on drugs. We
Yes.
have to do all this. And so it was seen as a moral thing. And it was seen as, let's employ militaristic language. Let's, excuse me, let's deploy a militarized police to deal with what is a psychological / medical issue. But
Mhm.
now that is Ashley, Ainsley, Paisley, and Madison out on opioids
Mhm.
because they got
Oh,
addicted to Percocet.
yep.
Because they got addicted to Percocet because they had a tennis injury, or because they got in a car accident, or
Yep.
because of this and that and the other. Now all of a sudden it's compassion.
Yeah. No.
It's we gotta show love to these people. We gotta show compassion to these people.
Yeah. No, I know. It is, so much. I think human beings by nature are Pharisees. And so when it happens to you, it's a moral failing. When it happens to me, I'm a victim of something. So, so
Yes.
the opioid addicts are victims of big pharma. Um,
Yes.
but when it's Black people on crack, yeah, well, it's like you're saying, a moral.
We're not victims of Ronald Reagan and the CIA.
Yeah, right.
We're not victims. We're not victims of, because it wasn't just the crack epidemic. It was heroin. It was heroin too
Yep.
in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was heroin. It was cocaine. It was all these things that were being pumped into our neighborhoods, that weren't being enforced. Their use and their distribution not being prevented or enforced.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's a shame. And I think that a lot of Christians, that they imbibe those ideas easily, because because a lot of people are taught, oh well, we're sinners, we have this sin nature, blah 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 blah. And so it's very easy then for people to believe, well, this is just how somebody is. This is
Mhm.
just how they are. This is off topic, but it's not. But I was thinking, I recently watched the Shiny Happy People documentary about the Duggar family and about the group, the sect that they were part of. And I remember being very angry. I still feel very angry, because years ago I clocked who Josh Duggar was years ago. Whenever the original molestation accusations came out in 2015, I had posted on my personal Facebook. I was just like, yeah, this thing has blown all the way up, and I had clocked. I was like, this dude's acting like a predator. Like, this dude's a predator. And so many Christians, people that I went to church with, which is like really flipping alarming, but they showed up and they were like, well, we should just, we don't know his story, and we should forgive, and we should extend him grace. And well, so then the thing that got me too is that people then started comparing their sin, their testimony, their story to Josh Duggar. Well, I was someone who I stole, I did this, I did that, and I would hate to think that my family wouldn't trust me or would treat me this way, or the way that you would want him to be treated, or whatever. And I'm like, y'all, if there is a difference between you stealing money from your family and somebody molesting their sister. There is
Right.
a difference. Those
Right.
aren't the same thing. But
Right.
people are so, because a lot of evangelicalism teaches all sins are the same, and blah 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 blah. All sins are the same in the eye of God, blah 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 blah.
Yep.
And we don't realize the implication. And we're taught to be like, well, people, let's say we, it's not me. They're taught to be like, well, but my sin was so bad, and so my sin was so bad, and God forgave me, so I gotta forgive just the way that I was forgiven, blah 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 blah. No, judge lest not you be judged by the same measure. I'm not molesting kids.
Right.
So I can judge the child molester. I can
Right.
judge the person and say, no, this isn't right. And I'm not God. Whether they're forgiven, whether they've asked for forgiveness, repented, that's God's business. That ain't my business. That's between them and their God. But what I can do here on this here earth is say, you know what? That's a problem. There are boundaries that need to be set in place. And somebody who has a national platform, we should not platform this person or their family as family values people, because it wasn't just that it happened, it's that they covered it up and that they made systemic efforts for over a decade to cover this issue up. That's the problem. But so many people got so mad about that because so many people were so big upset at me that I took that stance because they tried to place themselves in Josh Duggar's story and compare those two things that you should not be comparing yourself to, period.
Well,
and so,
No, I was just going to say it's sort of like mitigating or minimizing racism. Well, racism is sin. We're all sinners. And so it's choosing which sins are going to be big and which sins are going to be minimized, number one. And then number two, you look at the long-term effects of molesting children and the long-term effects, generational effects of systemic racism. And those are not the same as telling a lie.
Exactly.
Same.
It's not the same as shoplifting.
No,
it just isn't.
Right.
And people try to make those comparisons, and you went exactly where I was going with racism, where then because there is such a shallow view of sin. That is people are gonna be angry, people are gonna be like, oh, she's a heretic, whatever. That is a shallow view of sin. To be like, well, the guy that is a serial killer and the guy that is the person that's a pedophile, the person that is a rapist, that those things are on the same moral plane as you shoplifted, you lied, you stole something from somebody, you committed adultery, you blah, 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 blah. Those are not on the same moral plane. Now, I can't speak for God. I can't speak for how God views those things. And I believe that it's not that somebody that repents is any less of one sin is any less forgiven than the other person. That's what I'm saying. Christ is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. But that doesn't keep us from consequences. That doesn't keep us from experiencing consequences on this earth and from people interacting with the community, society, interacting with that person differently because of what they did. So we interact differently with people who commit certain sins. So I had a good friend, my husband and I had a good friend who, I don't know if he knew that we knew, but we knew that he had molested some children. Now, we were friends with him before we had kids. And so we knew we had become friends with him, and then we had found out about what had happened. And so we were kind to him. He was a contractor. He had done some services for us whenever we first bought our first house. We sat down, had meals with him because we didn't have kids. So what he did didn't affect us directly as people. And so we were kind to him. We showed kindness and Christian hospitality and generosity toward him. But then after we had children, guess who didn't come over for dinner? Who didn't get an invitation? We were still kind. We would see him somewhat regularly, not like see him because we interacted in similar circles. And so, like whenever we saw him, it was, hey, how you doing? Whatever. We did not say an unkind word to him, but also because we knew who he was, we weren't going to have him all up in our house around our kids. We weren't going to be like our kids actually never even were ever face to face with this individual because we knew we like whenever we were young single people, we could afford to be there. Like, okay, you know, like you have this, you have this problem.
Yeah.
We could be there and be kind to this person because of our position in society. And
Mhm.
that's and so you can, so like how you interact with people has to change whenever
Mm.
somebody does something. If you know somebody has kleptomania and will steal the stench out of Dookie, if you know that,
You don't leave them alone
then
with the
you don't
curse.
leave them alone with your, like, you don't leave it, you don't say, okay, cool, you don't have that person be your house sitter whenever you
Right,
go on a, that doesn't mean that you can't be nice to them, it doesn't
right.
mean that you can't talk to them, it doesn't mean that you can't go out to a meal to them, it just means that you interact with them differently. And
Mhm.
so Christians, a lot of evangelical Christians have such a, they, because sin has been flattened to be, if you lie, if you deceive somebody for from something, and if you go out and shoot somebody, it's all the same. And
Mhm.
it's God's grace that is
Mhm.
the same. It doesn't, it's not us. It's not, and so, but people conflate that, and they
Yeah.
think that it's Christ-like to then, and that's why sex abuse is rampant in certain areas of the church, because because they flatten it, and
Mm.
well, then it becomes, well, but it's, but if Jesus is faithful and just to forgive people, we should forgive people too. It's not my job.
Yeah.
That's not my job. Again, that's God's business.
And
And whether or not I forgive a person who has sinned against me, again, is not your business. Is whose business? Is God's business. Is
yeah,
between me and God. But people,
yeah,
but Christians want to dictate how everybody acts. But it's not. But it's not. But that's like a whole tangent. But it's like. But it applies. Apply it. Copy and paste to
yeah,
racism, because they do the same stuff with racism.
yeah. Right. And also, what you're saying is just very, very milk toast about sin, no matter what sin it is, if the sinner is a white person.
Ooh,
But
say
if
it.
the sinner is a black person, there are people who think George Floyd got what he deserved because he used a counterfeit $20 bill, or allegedly used a counterfeit
Allegedly,
20.
yes.
So there are
Yeah.
people who walk the earth believing that a man deserved to be executed in the street without a trial because he allegedly used a fake $20 bill. And there are Christians
Mm.
among them.
Yes.
So when it comes to white sin, there's all kinds of grace, there's all kinds of benefit of the doubt, there's all kinds of room. But when it comes to black sin, if we sneeze wrong, if our kid is just a tiny bit disrespectful to a police officer, if our child is a tiny disrespectful to a teacher, well, suspension is what you deserve. Well, being cuffed is what you deserve.
Being
So
killed is what you
being killed
deserve.
is what you deserve. So it's a very unequal weights, and we know what God thinks about unequal weights.
Well, say it. Amen. Amen and amen. And what you said is so very true, that whenever it comes to black people, because we're not seen as people.
Yeah.
We're not like that. That's really what it comes down to, is that we are seen as deserving of the full weight and measure of consequences on this earth. We are seen that way
Mhm.
because we're not seen as humans
Mhm.
worthy of the right to have a full measure of dignity, the
Mhm.
right to make mistakes, to make bad decisions, to be the victim of circumstances. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you knock on that door thinking that that's where your brothers are, and somebody shoots you. People just think that we deserve that type of thing. And it's like what you said earlier, whenever you are the person who has the thing that happens, you deserve it. But if you deserved it, but if it's me, I'm a victim. Like
Mhm.
if it's me, I'm a victim. But if it's somebody else, and that's the way that a lot of our white siblings in Christ, how they view race, how they view racism, how they view those sins
Mhm.
is, well, whenever it is us, clearly this person was a victim. Clearly this is whatever. But whenever it's y'all, whenever black people, whenever it's y'all are guilty. And I actually have a chapter in I Won't Shut Up in my book about whenever Michael Brown was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And because that was a moment for me, that was a moment that sort of propelled me to speak out more about racism. And there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it there. But that propelled me to speak out about racism. And I noticed, because Ferguson, that's in Missouri, that's outside St. Louis. So I had a lot of friends who were St. Louisans, and just in general, it was a Missouri thing. So it was very kind of heightened. People really just kind of felt that. I didn't live in Missouri at the time that happened, but I saw people's response to Ferguson. And this very thing is something that I discuss in my book as it relates to the killing of Michael Brown and the Christian response to that. And over the years, it was Michael Brown, but back then, but it's happened so many times over, that the response it's almost, you can script it. Like it's so common the way that it happens, that you could almost like have Chat GPT like generate you a script for it, because it's so the way that it always goes down. It always is blame the victim. It's always we know all the facts, and so we're gonna judge this person here on social media. But yeah.
Yes. For our remaining moments, I do want to talk a little bit more about your book. I feel like we just need to have dinner or something and talk about this stuff. It's just so interesting. So I won't shut up. So you talked a little bit about what's included in your book, Mike Brown and stuff, speaking out. Why was speaking out a thing for you? Why didn't you speak out in the past? And then why did you start speaking out? And why was that a choice? Some people have been speaking out their whole life. So why did you have to choose not to shut up? Why did you have to choose to find your voice?
Yeah. So, growing up in a predominantly white town, doing a lot of my living and growing in predominantly white contexts, I learned that racism was an issue that it was my job to handle silently. So if somebody was going to be, I learned that you position yourself in the world as a Black person to not experience racism. Mm-hmm. So an example of that is if I'm at a picnic with a bunch of white people, and they have hamburgers, hot dogs, fried chicken, watermelon, coleslaw, potato salad on the menu.
Sounds good.
I learned, sounds really good. Well, I learned, I don't want to, if I sit down and I'm eating fried chicken and watermelon, people are going to say something to me. They're gonna make jokes. Mm-hmm. They're gonna think that it's cute and that it's funny, and I'm gonna have to hear a whole lot of racist nonsense. So you learn to, well, I'm not gonna eat chicken and watermelon. I'm not gonna eat fried chicken in front of these people. I'm not gonna eat watermelon. I'm not gonna eat a banana in front of these people. And that's like one small example of like the myriad of things that you do, that you learn to make adjustments to yourself, because you learn, well, if you call them out on the racism, well, then they're going to get upset. They're going to get mad. They're going to get angry because you said that they were racist, because being called a racist, of course, is worse than experiencing racism. Right. And so they are going to be upset. So then you're going to have to manage their feelings. You're going to have to, try to get them to feel good about themselves, because they don't want to hear that they're racist. They don't want to hear that they did something that violated you. Mm-hmm. So you learn to just avoid it. You learn to do whatever you can to avoid racism. And so that might mean even somebody makes a racist joke, and I just developed this laugh that was like, yeah. And like, it was a sarcastic laugh that was like, I don't think this is funny, but I'm not going to tell you, yo, that was racist. Right. Because if I call you racist, you're going to be mad. So I'm just going to be like, yeah, oh, that was, yeah. And you go on about your business. Mm-hmm. You learn to just sort of be like, you learn to just ignore things that people say. You learn to just whatever. Mm-hmm. And so you learn to take it and not to speak up, because speaking up comes with punishment, and it comes with various forms of punishment. So realizing that, so I literally thought that it was my job that if there was not going to be racism, it was my job to protect white people from their own worst impulses. And
Yes.
so so I'm positioning and twisting and contorting myself to protect white people from their worst impulses. So then in doing that, you silence yourself. I found myself realizing that I am changing myself. So then the moment that I realized, and some of this was a process too, as a young adult, just being like, you know what, actually, like, because even the sarcastic laugh, that was something that I developed in my early 20s,
Yeah.
where as a kid it was just like, oh, okay, as a kid it was like, oh, let me just make the joke so nobody else has to, so let me just make the joke because it's a lot funnier if I say it, then I can laugh at it, than to have somebody else say it. So you develop like a, so there's other, like, in other words, defense mechanisms that you
Mm-hmm.
create,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't actually say how you really feel.
Mm-hmm.
So some of this, as through some of my early 20s and stuff, I sort of was like, I sort of learned that I started to learn that I could talk back to racism a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But then with Michael Brown, that was the moment, and I talk about this in the book. That was the moment. My oldest was about 4 months old, whenever that happened, and I just realized, I was seeing images that reminded me so much of the civil rights movement. And my parents were children during the civil rights movement. They were each born in 1955 and 1956, they remember, each of them remembers where they were and what happened whenever Martin Luther King died, was assassinated. They remember that. They remember aspects of their lives before the Civil Rights Act was passed, and they like, that was their lived experience. And then of course my grandparents and my older aunties and uncles definitely remember segregation, definitely remember Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff. And so I remember as a kid, my mom, my older relatives telling me about their lives before the civil rights movement. And I remember being a kid and learning about these things in history class, or reading about these things, because I was really into history as a kid, like reading about some of these things and, doing the math and being like, oh, my mom she would have been, she would have been 2 years old whenever Brown versus Board of Education happened. Oh, she would have been, she would have been like 13 years old whenever the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed, and, all these different things. And I realized that my child, if she was anything like me, was going to do the same thing whenever she inevitably was going to read about Mike Brown's killing, about the Black Lives Matter movement, about Trayvon Martin, about all this stuff. She was going to read about that in history books. I knew it in the moment. As I'm watching all this stuff happen, I knew it in the moment. This is history. This is history in the making. I'm living in history. And so I realized that I needed to say something, because she was going to ask me. I knew she would ask me, well, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do during this time? You were 29 years old. What did you do? And I couldn't tell her, well, I just sat back and was watching Downton Abbey, because I watched Downton Abbey, and that's something from the book, like why I was watching Downton Abbey. But like, it was, but Downton Abbey, that was my comfort show whenever I was pregnant with her. And but I love watching rich white people. I love watching white mess, like any show with white people that are being messy and like whatever. I'm here for it. Virgin River, I love that show. I'm here for the mess. So anyway, I realized, I couldn't tell her, well, hey, I was just chilling. Like, I was just out here. I was just watching it on TV. I was just watching it on Twitter. I was just reading the tweets. I realized I couldn't do that. I needed to tell her that I did something. Yes. And so for me, that something was simply on my own personal social media, was just whenever I would see the racism, it would be like, look, I am seeing this racism. Y'all don't understand what is happening, and breaking it down and trying to explain it to these white people, essentially early on, honestly, just pleading with white people to see Black people with dignity and humanity, because people were literally making comments like, well, these animals need to go back to the jungle. Like, people were saying stuff like that. Like, oh, well, if you're going to act like an animal, you need to go back to the jungle because you're looting and destroying and blah, 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 and all this other type of stuff. And I'm literally just pleading for people to see Black people with dignity and humanity, and to not use racist language, and to understand that whenever Black people saw Michael Brown, we hear that his body laid uncovered in the street for 4 hours, It wasn't about the facts of, well, he might have shoplifted, which he didn't. It wasn't about, well, he might have grabbed for Darren Wilson's gun. It wasn't about all of that. It was about that boy's body was in the street, uncovered like an animal. They don't treat roadkill like that. You don't treat a dead possum like that. But his body was laying in that street uncovered for 4 hours for God and everybody to see as his blood spilled into that gutter. And we don't just see him, we see Emmett Till. Yes. We don't just see him. I had a nephew. One of my nephews was his age, was his exact age. I didn't see Michael. I saw my nephew who was that exact age. I saw all my nephews, all my cousins, all my whatever who were that same age. I saw my uncles. I saw my big cousins. I saw my daddy. I saw my daddy who had just gotten out of being incarcerated a couple years before that, for standing his ground against some people. And like I saw that, and I could, and that's what a lot of us saw in Michael Brown. Yes. And so I couldn't just sit back and not say anything,
especially since I can imagine that on your social media, some of these people are your friends.
Yes. Yes. They're my friends, and they were people, some of them were Christians, active in their church.
Yes.
Pastors. There was a pastor, a person who literally was pastoring a church in Missouri, who posted, "Pants up, don't loot." And instead of "hands up, don't shoot," "pants up, don't loot." The layers of racism, the layers of missing the point in that was infuriating. It was hurtful and infuriating, because again, these aren't just people. It's Missouri. It's home. It's people who lived right up the road from stuff. So it's like y'all are upset about a McDonald's that you never would have visited because it was in the hood. Y'all never would have stopped off. Y'all upset that somebody burned down that McDonald's. You never would have stopped off at that McDonald's. Like don't even act like you went to Ferguson for anything. Some people I even knew went to a Bible college that was in the same neighborhood, that was just around the corner, literally, from where Michael Brown was shot. And it's like, y'all wasn't trying to be over there. Y'all acting all scary. Y'all wasn't even trying to be over there. Like, whatever. And so y'all acting scary. Y'all live in South City. Y'all acting scary about something like, oh, if they come down here. Nobody's coming down there. Nobody cares about Melville. Nobody cares about South City. Like nobody or South County. Like nobody cares. Yeah. And it was wild. And like it was just wild how people acted, and how Christians specifically acted. How that was, because a lot of people on my friends list on Facebook was Christians. A lot of these were people that I had sat on pews with.
Yeah.
That I had been their camp counselor at church camp.
Yeah.
That I had been there with, I was Pentecostal at the time, and a lot of them I had prayed some of their kids through to the Holy Ghost, where they received the gift of tongues, and I had been there praying with them at the altar. I had been there whenever I was helping them get their baptismal garments on. And I would have, some people like, oh, I probably would have been some folks, their black friend, that whenever they thought of the black friend, there's some people that I knew that for whom I was probably one of those black friends that they thought about.
Yeah.
And they were showing out.
Yeah. And for me, with a lot of friends like that, for years I had shut up. Meaning, like you're saying about the sarcastic laugh, I had just, well, I said something, let me not say anything else so that they don't think that I'm extreme, or so
exactly.
They don't. Yes. And so I don't know if it was the same with you, but for me, for a long time, it was biting my tongue. It was closeting who I was, to not be rejected, to not be perceived in a certain way, to try to keep the peace, but at the end of the day, I lost myself.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then, for me, it was a lot of these things that happened in the news, plus also my sister obviously is also biracial, and her ex-husband is white, but I married a very dark Jamaican. So I have a husband that looks like, is the same skin tone
Mm-hmm.
as George Floyd. I have two black teenage sons. So
Mm-hmm.
so it's not only um like you're saying, infuriated at what you're seeing in the media and stuff and people's responses. It's like you said about, it could be my nephew. it's
Yeah.
it's very personal. and
Mm-hmm.
and I remember when Barack Obama said about Trayvon Martin, it could be my son. People lost their minds when he said that,
Yes,
when
they
he
sure
made it
did.
when he made it personal. All he was doing was just trying to express sorrow,
Mm-hmm.
and that level of sorrow wasn't even allowed. So
Yes.
yeah. Anyway.
Yes. All of that, yeah, definitely. The idea, what you said about the being silenced and about losing yourself, that is it. Those are topics exactly that I cover, and I won't shut up, because that's what it does. Is it takes from us our ability to express ourselves. It takes from us the ability to confront what happened, because we don't want to be labeled. We don't want for people to think we don't want for people to think, well, she's militant, we can't get along, because it can lose you opportunities. It can lose you your life. It can lose you opportunities. You lose friendships.
Mhm.
I've lost friendships whenever I started speaking out about these things. People started unfriending me on social media. Like, that was primarily where I was speaking out. I was also speaking out. I had attended a predominantly white church. It was multi-ethnic, but it was predominantly white church at the time, and I made a lot of people uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And I made a lot of people, and I wasn't even like really saying anything. Like, I look back, I was like, I
Well,
wasn't really saying anything. I really was doing a whole lot of bowing and scraping, and please, like whatever. I was doing a whole lot of shucking and jiving at the time, and people still could not take that. They
yeah.
still they had such low capacity for pushback.
Mhm.
And so for me, it's like, realizing, because again, in my mind, in my heart, in my spirit, in my soul, I've always been, black to my core. And
Mhm.
so for me, it wasn't about assimilation. It wasn't about, but like, where the positions I found myself in, it wasn't about well, I've got to try to be different because I think that blackness is somehow inferior or whatever. And I mentioned, earlier, that I was married to a white man, and so a lot of my husband found, a lot. He heard a lot of the not a lot, pretty much all of the unfiltered, like, whatever. Because, I mean, he knew from the time we had started dating, whenever um we were 17 years old. Like, I think he was 16 for like a little bit, and then just turned 17. And so, he knew from Jump Street that being with me meant being with a black woman. And
Mhm.
that was a part of myself that I was not going to try to change or subsume or hide, or to try to, like I wasn't going to try to, sit here and intentionally, try to code switch and stuff. And
Mhm.
so he had to learn. He
Mhm.
had, like, there were things that, I mean, and he comes from a family that, is a good family. They are not, his parents, and my brother and sister-in-law, who are younger than him, they are not like overtly racist people. They were not, they didn't he, said his parents never acted like they disapproved of our relationship or anything like that, which is rare for where we came from. But they disapproved of how young we got married. That was where the disapproval was. We got married whenever we were 19 years old.
Right.
Got engaged at 18, married at 19. That was the disapproval. And some people, I say that, and people don't believe that. No, like I'm not gonna I know when I lived.
Yeah.
My in-laws were not upset. They were more upset that we were like
Done.
kids
Didn't make money
than
yet.
yeah, exactly. We were in college. We were
Yeah.
freshmen in college.
Yeah.
Like they were more upset about that
Mm-hmm.
than they were about my skin color, whatever. Now they have had to learn over the years. That's not like they have had to learn. There have been times whenever I have had to correct them and be like, no, like that ain't it. Like no, and again they've always been kind to me, like whatever, I can say that without guile. But they've always been kind to me, that I've never felt like they were ignorant toward me or anything like that. But they had to learn, just like, I mean, a lot of white people, they are white people who grew up in the same predominantly white area that I grew up in. And so, like, of course, if they had not had many interactions and not with Black people, of course, they weren't going to know. There were things that they weren't going to know about culture, that they weren't going to know, how to do my kids' hair. They weren't going to know certain things, and so they had to learn. And so thankfully they've always been willing to learn. And there's been some hard lessons that they've had to learn, like, hey, yeah, don't let my kids play with the kids across the street who their family has a Confederate flag on their house. Like that, like enough to not let my kids go over there, but I don't want those kids over here. Like, right. I don't want they are advertising their ignorance. So I don't want my children interacting with those children. It's very kind of you to want my kids to have somebody to play with, but they don't need playmates that bad. Thank you. There were things that they had to learn. But with my husband, he's had to learn. One of the first things that we did as a married couple is watch Roots. Watch the movie. It's like I'll be like, okay. I mean, we grew up in the same town, got the same history, like whatever. I'm like, no, we are gonna watch this, and we're gonna talk about this. You're gonna know about like you're gonna know about these things. Like, I'm gonna speak my dialect, and you're gonna have to learn what I'm saying, because I can't explain it to you, and I'm not gonna explain it to you, so you're just gonna have to learn how to translate. And so it's funny because like sometimes he doesn't do it on, like, my husband's not like one of those, he's not a cookout white, like he's not one of those white people that's like, oh, I'm trying, like I'm gonna wear my hat the way, and I'm gonna have my hair all cut. Like he is a white guy. Like he's not trying to be, he's not like Gary Owens or whatever, like trying to get invited to the cookout. He is white, and he is, but sometimes like he'll say stuff, and I'll be like, and I'll repeat what he said because he'll use some of my isms. Like he was telling one of our kids the other day, or telling one of my kids yesterday, like he was like, "Don't be tearing that up," and I was like, "Oh, really? Don't be tearing that up." and so he'll say like just this little things will come out, and that he'll say that he's gotten from me, that I'm like, you wouldn't say that. And I'll say it, and he'll just be like he'll realize that he's, because of course we live together, so there's things that you're gonna, I know,
I was gonna say the two become one.
The two become one, but I let him every step of the way. I'm like, oh really, you're saying this now, and so he kind of laughs. But that was a very easy thing for me with him. He's always understood. He's always been there. He's always been there with me every step of the way in that. And that's a relationship that I didn't have to kind of fake the funk in and be like, oh, okay, like, oh, you, like, whatever. I could just say like, okay, like there was one time, like this, probably a year or two ago, he had said something where I can't remember like what he had said. Like he was like, I got to get it right, because it's gonna make it sound really bad if I don't get it right. But we were watching a show, and he had said something about like, oh yeah, like we're over here like well, I can't remember what he said. I don't want to misquote him, so I'm not gonna say it. So I don't want to misquote him because it's gonna make it sound, because what I'm gonna say is gonna make it sound worse than what he actually said. Yes. But he had made a comment like where he had made a comment where I remember like he had said the word slave, but it wasn't like, oh, I'm making fun of slavery. It was like literally like there was something, and he said like, oh, this person like was like a slave to this, or like whatever it was. And I was like, this person was a slave to that? And he was like, oh yeah, I mean, what I meant was, and like I had to be like, this out of choice of words
Right.
to use. And there's times where I had to been like, like where in explaining things, where we're explaining race and racism, where he's been like, but what about this and whatever, and I've been like, child, you are acting like an entire white man. I need for you to listen. I need for you to listen with your listening ears and your heart, and not with whatever it is that you listen with, that you're not listening with right now. And so we there's been times where we've had to where I had to have had a hard conversation with with his parents. Let my kids play with the Confederate flag people. I had to have a hard conversation because that was something that I had said, that I had told him to convey to his parents. As soon as I saw that go up on the house, I was like, you need to tell your parents this and that and the third, like don't have my kids with those people. And so that was his responsibility to tell them this, that, and the third. And he did tell them this, that, and the third. But he did not like make it clear enough, apparently. So I was like, them's your parents. Like you deal with them because I can't. Because they won't like me if I talk to them, they won't like me. They won't like me anymore because I was mad, so I was going to be ignorant about it. It's why they would have accepted the correction, but I just would have been ignorant, and I wanted to respect my in-laws. So I was like, you talk to your parents about their thing. You know how that goes sometimes, where it's like them's your parent, that's your mama. She gonna love you no matter what. She don't have to like me, but she's gonna love you no matter what. So you tell her. And so that that was a hard conversation, because I was upset because I was really upset, because I'm like, oh, them kids, like what, my kid, like what, you have my kids where? And so like you have my kids playing with who? And so like those are hard. So there have been times where we have had to have conversations where I've had to be like, that I don't think that's it. But for the most part, that relationship by and large has been a positive relationship. But a lot of my interactions with white people, not that they've been like all characterized as negative, but like a lot of my interactions with white people as it pertains to race and racism, it's the defensiveness. It's the, I've got to like I'm gonna be like if I say something, then you're gonna act like I'm doing something that I'm not doing, when really I'm just telling you, like, bro, like your slip is showing. Don't do this. This is you're telling me that you don't want to be you're telling, because this is actually something that's in the book, where it's like, you're telling me that you want to have a diverse church, but then some stuff is happening that is hurting the unity of the diversity of this church, and you don't want to hear that. You want to be angry. You want to respond a certain way rather than listening. And so, because sometimes it's like, you are my friend. You want to be my friend. You don't want to be seen as racist, yet you won't listen whenever somebody is telling you, hey, that behavior is racist. It doesn't, they act like it's like the unpardonable sin, being called a racist. I remember somebody one time told me that being called a racist was like they called it the R word, the R slur. And I was confused at first, as I thought that they meant like the other R word for like, intellectual disabilities. I was like, I did not call you that, but they meant racist. And I was like, that, like, but it was like, that's just as hurtful as being called the N-word. A white person, first of all, what do you know about being called the N-word? Number one, nothing. Number two, I too have been called a racist, and I can tell you from experience that my feelings were hurt a lot more by being called the N-word than by somebody calling me a racist. So your whole thing doesn't quite hold up. But they want to be so just like whatever about it. And it's like, you try to tell them, but then you learn, like I said, they make sure that you learn not to say things. And I it's hard to relate to that aspect of just you end up losing yourself. You end up just being like, it ain't worth it. It ain't worth it to speak up. It ain't worth it to say something. It ain't worth it. And so you don't say anything.
Yeah. Right. And then when you finally decide to speak up, I think we just make the decision, my friends will be my friends. And if I wind up at the end of the day with two friends, then those will be two good friends. But I'm not going to lose myself anymore.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And what you said about being called a racist, I think it would be impossible to live in America Dr. Beverly Tatum says that cultural racism is like smog in the air. It's impossible not to breathe it in. So I think everybody has been tainted by it. And
Hmm.
especially as Christians, we should welcome, the iron sharpening iron, the speaking the truth
Yes.
in love, um, and not be fragile, not be so defensive and refuse to learn. So this has been so rich, Ally. This is just, like I said, I wish we could continue this over dinner. I'll have to look you
Yes.
up when I'm in Chicago.
Yes.
I'm writing a book myself about raising biracial kids, and so much of what I have written so far are things that we touched on, and this conversation will really help inform some of my book too. Just
That's wonderful. That's
yeah,
awesome.
biracial kids know inhabiting all of who they are, and not trying to assimilate, and not losing
Hmm.
themselves,
Yes.
and not only being proud of half of themselves, being proud of all of themselves.
Yeah.
Um, so all that good stuff. But anyway, our listeners should definitely today order I Won't Shut Up, Finding Your Voice When the World Tries to Silence You. I think it's germane for to anybody, any person of color. I also think it's germane to women. I think it's important read for everybody, no matter how melanated you may be. So I can't wait to read it myself. So thank
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited for people to read it.
thank you so much. May it go far and wide and just really help to, being anti-racist is like rain on the ground. And when the ground is hard, the rain doesn't penetrate. But the softer the ground gets, the more it penetrates. And may your book find soft ground.
Thank you so much. Amen. Amen and amen.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye bye.